So as I was saying, this session is focused on the institutional challenge. So as we see this incredible pace and depth and nature of this kind of transformation to our economy and to our working lives and to our societies, what are the institutions that we need in order to make that transition fair, both at an individual, a firm, a kind of regional ecosystem, different levels, but also to meet the challenge of ensuring that this kind of expands access to good work. If we're setting a target for how to transform the economy, then having better work overall would be a good kind of aim in that context. And how do we do that with regard to the kind of pace and complexity of this transformation as it's happening in practice? So this is obviously important in light of some of the findings that we have from the Pissarides review that demonstrated that there could be a tendency in this particular transition to consolidate some of the inequalities that arose during earlier industrial transformations, and that place-based economies have different resilience to these kind of impacts, with employers making different choices about adoption and changing jobs in different ways in different localities. So in kind of places with poorer and weaker innovation ecosystems tending to change jobs in ways that decrease skills demand, decrease the number of jobs, and can decrease quality of work. So how do we turn that around? What are the institutions that will help with that? Also, as Simon's been speaking to in the last session, because we need to think about how to ensure that the law remains a kind of instrument to help distribution. But the good news is that the government is already doing a lot and thinking a lot in this space. So I'm incredibly honoured to have on the panel with me and excited to hear from Mary Jones, who has the no small task of being the Director of AI Strategy and Preparedness at DSIT. Bart van Ark, Professor Bart van Ark, who is a Professor of Productivity at Manchester Business School and also a Director of the Productivity Institute. And also Professor Simon Deakin, who is a Professor of Law at the University of Cambridge and also a member of the DSIT Centre. So we'll start with Mary. Your role sits at the centre of how government is thinking about AI preparedness and national resilience. What's been a big focus? There's been a big focus on kind of accelerating adoption, but maybe less of a kind of conversation about the why and how to get that right. So what is the presiding why?
Thank you. Is that working? Yeah. So I'll start with why do we think adoption is important, and then sort of get into the how do we get that right. So the government has made clear that making the UK one of the fastest adopter in the G7 is an overriding priority. And I think we hear a lot about that being about seizing opportunities, the estimates being a sort of 55 to 130 billion growth in GVA per annum, potentially from that sort of adoption opportunity. But I think also it's important to underscore, and I think this goes to the point about getting it right, that we also see peril of not adopting. We have world-leading sectors in the UK, and for example, financial services and legal services, and life sciences, for example. And we don't see a world in which we stay at the forefront with all of the jobs and opportunity that entails, unless we are also at the cutting edge of AI adoption as well. So that's why adoption is important. I think, how do you get it right? Absolutely, I think the starting point needs to be that accelerating adoption doesn't necessarily lead to a kind of fair and distributed accrual of benefits. And I think government is very open-eyed to that. And from the outset, we've been trying to design an approach that, first of all, helps us understand where are these impacts hitting. So our Future of Work programme, which will also come to be part of the AI Economics Institute that's been announced, is a really critical step in that. It's about accruing data from multiple different sources and understanding what is happening in the labour market. It's about seeing early warning signals and responding to that. And Abby is on our expert panel, and we're very fortunate to have her there. I think then moving on from that, what do you do about those distributional impacts? And what is the sort of tools that government in particular has? There's a huge amount of uncertainty about how this plays out, but we talk about no regrets options. That's why upskilling is a huge focus for government at the moment. We think that by equipping people with skills, but also making them just sort of more comfortable and literate with the technology. That's a huge kind of no regrets step. And then we are also looking carefully at distributional impacts and what are the sort of local kind of impacts and economies and how would they play into labour market transition. We have our Tech Town programme, which has Barnsley as our sort of leading tech town. That's a place that has been on the wrong side of industrial revolution before, that sort of really sort of carries that in its identity. And they put their hands up to basically be at the forefront of how do you do this well? How can we really sort of flood the town with AI, but also really, again, focus on upskilling, focus on how do we grow jobs and opportunities in Barnsley and how do we crowd people in there. So that's a really interesting pilot project. We're really lucky to have Barnsley leading the way in that respect. So that's a couple of thoughts. I'll pause there because I know this is the opening and I look forward to expanding on that.
Thank you, Mary. So Bart, we've recently come out of another productivity week where the focus was on better outcomes for people, firms and places. What is AI challenging us to rethink in terms of what productivity is, how it relates to value, and what we should measure to ensure success in the future economy?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And you're right, we had National Productivity Week, which is the third time we did that just 2 weeks ago, over 25 events. I didn't attend all of them, but I can tell you that the 10 or so that I did attend, I think there was not a single one where AI was not being discussed. So this is just the topic of the day, and it was very, very visible during that week. And a couple of pieces of work that we may come to talk about a little later that are quite relevant, looking at this also from a regional or a place-based perspective. But on your question around how do we think about AI in relation to productivity, creating better outcomes for people, firms and places, you know, at the heart of it, you know, looking at it from a productivity perspective, AI is basically about two things, right? It's about investments in R&D in order to create AI-related software. And the second is to use that AI-related software in order to make business processes more productive and in order to create new products and services. I mean, you don't have to make it a lot more complicated than that. That's essentially what it is, R&D in AI-related software, and then use that AI-related software there. And if you just look at that, if that's sort of a narrow definition of productivity as economists like me tend to use them, there's no doubt that the United States is doing tons times better than any other European country. There's no doubt that that is making it into massive investments and creating a huge tech pipeline. But when it comes to the questions about how many people and how many places, how many firms are going to benefit from that, I think that question is not yet answered. Because then it comes to the next question, and that's the question where the institutions come around, is what does that mean for the skill system that we have? What does it mean for the investments that we're making at a place-based level, in infrastructure, in housing, in healthcare, and all those kind of things that ultimately engage people with that kind of new technology? And I think, you know, we kind of on the background assume that the institutions can do both. And I think the key question for us is that really true? Can we actually have institutions to both create that sort of massive productivity effect from the technology and the AI substack that it is creating? And can we then also have the same institutions creating better outcomes for people, firms and places? And I think that question is not answered. It's certainly not happening in the United States, where we know that inequality of AI outcomes is huge, where there's no evidence in the US that adoption is more widespread and more broad-based than it is in European economies. So, and we don't have a lot of examples of European economies where both of these things are going very well. Yes, we can look at a few Nordic countries, and maybe we can talk about in a minute why they might be able to do this better than we are, or some other continental European countries are. But for me, that's kind of the fundamental question. So question one is, how do we think about productivity? Is it that narrow concept? Then it's pretty simple. And our answer would be massively invest in tech, massively invest in, you know, a couple of limited number of firms that are going to use that very well? Or do we want to have a much more inclusive approach to this, where I think we still have to think very hard about what the institutions, what they're looking like? Well, I'm sure we're picking up some of these issues later on.
And maybe just to probe a little bit more now before moving on to Simon. So I suppose you can think of institutions as ideas, as rules, and as resources, or institutions take different shapes. And it feels like the productivity idea part of this transformation is quite core to it. What do you think are the strengths and the weaknesses of productivity as a guiding principle for this transformation? What are its kind of limitations maybe?
So that really goes to the point of making sure that we go from that narrow economist definition that I talked about a minute ago to a broader definition, which is basically how we're using our limited resources, not just that software and not just these other new technologies, but also our skills of the workforce, our organizational capabilities. But when you look at it from a place-based perspective, how do we use infrastructure? How do we use different types of capital, like natural capital or even social capital? And how do we combine those in order to create this kind of better outcomes, right? So if you use that kind of broader definition, it becomes more of a guiding principle in order to create these kind of inclusive outcomes that we're actually thinking. So we're doing a lot of work at the Productivity Institute to actually look at the place-based level at a very broad-based investment approach. So we're looking at investments in physical capital, in human capital, but also in these other types of capital, in infrastructure and finance and social and community type of capital. And if you begin to do that, and we have actually been doing this research at different places in the UK to see is there a kind of integrated investment strategy around it? And the answer to that is most of the time no. Most places are aware of the need for this broad-based type of investment strategy, but it's very siloed, even at the place-based level. I've been at events at one place where we had actually further education colleges and the local government for the first time actually discussing these kind of issues. We never really thought about it in this way, that we actually have to join up these different kinds of investments. So you need to have that kind of integrative approach in order to make that inclusive kind of approach happen as well.
Very interesting, thinking about coordination in investment in the future there. So Simon, what are your reflections on what you've heard so far?
Well, thinking about this as a lawyer, I would say there are two things law can do here. So firstly, law should be facilitating technological change, and it does that not just through IP law, but also through company and corporate law. It does it by facilitating the organisation of capital. It also does it by promoting venture capital. So the UK has a really good legal framework for all those things, and that's partly why we have such a large venture capital ecosystem in this country. Other reasons for our large venture capital ecosystem include the role our universities play. Public funding for research is absolutely critical. If you think about somewhere like the Cambridge area, the so-called Cambridge phenomenon, that venture capital ecosystem, not just AI, but that's a very important part of it, digitalization, digital technologies, the contribution of the life sciences, our biomedical campus, much of that goes back to public investment. So you have a public-private partnership in an area like Cambridge, maybe Oxford too, fair enough, and London. These things work really well. There's nothing at all unique about the south of England that says those things have to be located there. There can be similar clusters, there are similar clusters outside the golden triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge. There's no reason why that can't be replicated elsewhere. We have a strong legal framework, but also we have another role for law, which is not just to facilitate all these things. Law will play a role in regulating AI, will play a role in regulating technology. And we already see this. There are huge debates among lawyers about the nature of generative AI, about how it's being used, about whether data scraping, for example, is or is not legal, whether it does or does not involve fundamental breaches of copyright law and also data protection law. These are live issues being played out in the British courts and in the US courts and on the European mainland as well, and in China and in other countries. Courts in all countries are grappling with these issues. Now, it's not just a question of speeding things up or slowing them down. I think there's not necessarily a positive correlation between speeding things up and not having regulation. Right? We know this from history. There's a long history to the development of standards, of benchmarks, which have facilitated technological diffusion in the past, and will undoubtedly do so again. Right. So in the European mainland, in the EU, we have the AI Act. That's one particular model. We might come back to that. America, by no means, has no regulation on these issues, although it doesn't have an AI Act equivalent. You look at Japan. The Japanese approach is quite similar to ours. Okay, everything is being done at sector level. There's no overarching or horizontal AI Act in Japan, but there's a lot of technological progress in Japan. And China has its own approach again, which is partly a function of its particular political system and the need for the party state to oversee what is going on in what's essentially a developmental state economy, kind of teleological developmental state, which is planned over the long term. The fact that in China you can have a 20 or 30-year planning cycle may be an advantage for them. We have a different electoral cycle. Right? We have a different political system. We can't expect to replicate exactly what China has in that sense. But that doesn't mean that we can't forge a consensus on the type of long-term planning needed for the regulation of AI. And it will be regulation. It's not enough to say we just leave it alone and don't regulate it.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure we'll pick up on some of those threads, but perhaps that kind of reflection on the different forms of national political economy and their relationship to regulation that we can see internationally leads neatly into another one of the things that I wanted to ask you, Mary, which is kind of how can we ensure that the gains from AI are widely shared across regions, perhaps sectors, and different demographic groups, and what's the government doing about this at the moment?
Yeah, so I think that takes on from the thought that I said in my first answer, which is that we can't and we don't assume that the benefits from AI will be distributed fairly. I think there's a couple of things in the government strategy about trying to kind of correct, if I could use that word for that, and also to try and bucket them up into a few different thoughts. So I think firstly there's a sort of a broad strategic position, which is that we really do believe that the UK's advantage and where the UK can really be successful is at what we describe as the application layer, i.e. it's about how our innovative sectors, and that's, you know, all sectors can be innovative, are taking on AI and utilising it effectively. And in order to support that and to facilitate that, there's a couple of things we're doing. So we just finished off with regulation, but one of our initiatives is around our AI Growth Lab, which we've consulted on and are designing, which essentially is a cross-economy sandbox. It's where we can take an application that's very novel, and probably because of its, because AI is a general purpose technology in all of the use cases we've looked at, quite often it engages a number of different regulators, and the point of the Growth Lab is to bring those regulators together and to kind of safely allow that product to progress to market by looking at how would you adapt or amend regulations to enable that to happen. So that is a sort of facilitative measure to pick up on that theme. Then I think sort of beneath the strategic level, as I said before, we are actually looking at what are the kind of local interventions that we've got. I've already mentioned our Tech Town project, but also where we have our AI growth zones, which are essentially like the data infrastructure builds. Those are accompanied by packages to make sure that we can try and sort of facilitate an ecosystem that sits around it. I mean, I think unlike some of the other clusters that Bart was referring to, we are conscious that with data centers, it's not necessarily the case that you get the same spillover benefits from a data center. So actually what we want to do is much more link, you know, what are the businesses, what does the economy in the area look like, and how can we kind of support AI adoption in that area, and it's sort of more just drawing the link to sort of what does the infrastructure facilitate and what's happening in that area. And then I think the sort of final thing that I'd point to, again, is in looking at our adoption strategy, we talk about raising the ceiling, which is this sort of innovative layer. We talk about raising the core, which is about how can we kind of get that widespread adoption out. That's how we're looking at our industrial strategy sectors. And then we also talk about what we describe as stabilizing the floor, which is, you know, how do we actually kind of have a stability within the labour market? And I referenced briefly our upskilling work. We have a commitment to upskill 10 million workers in a sort of very broad industry partnership. That is progressing well, but I think, you know, we're very conscious that, you know, we've already heard a reference to what our skills institutions need to do. How do we join up across that system? I mean, that is a very sort of big area of inquiry for us in government at the moment. We work closely with our partners in Skills England, in DWP and DFE to actually think about the skills pathway all the way through, and you know, what are the quite radical options for what future lifelong learning looks like, for example. You know, how do we actually need to have a system that kind of works with this technology in the future? So, I mean, I think that's a sort of really live policy discussion that we're having, that lots of different institutions are having at the moment. I'm certainly interested to hear people's thoughts on it.
Amazing, thank you. And Simon, Mary mentioned there the kind of government's new Growth Labs initiative and the role of sandboxes, and you reflected on, I suppose, what might be a lack of clarity about the application of current law, but in the previous session also we heard some interesting statistics around the fact that well-established laws are commonly not being followed. What do you think the key challenge is in ensuring that the law supports this fair distribution and development of better work, and how do we address that challenge?
Yeah, so I think it does matter what kinds of laws we have, because those laws will influence the kind of tech we end up with. The nature of the technology is changing all the time, and it is itself shaped by the legal framework. So today's AI is very much the consequence of scientific innovations which go back decades. Things like the transformer technology are relatively new, but backpropagation and machine learning is that's not new. That's been around for a very long time. So what we see with AI, what we call AI, essentially at the moment, it's machine learning, right? So it's pattern replication. So-called agentic AI doesn't take humans out of the picture at all. In fact, we use language much too loosely in this context. Right? So AI, as we currently know it, is a very particular kind of technology with a very particular statistical base. It's very powerful, but it doesn't seem to me to come at all close to replicating human intelligence. Right? So we can put that debate to one side. We may have a debate at some future point about that sort of AI risk, but the immediate AI risk that we're facing is the risk that we've faced with many other technologies in the past, which is that those technologies seriously and severely, and we hope in the end productively, disrupt existing forms of social and economic organization. And because they're so disruptive, it really, I don't think, is a sufficient answer to say to people immediately affected by that disruption that they have to accept it in the name of progress. Right? That won't suffice. Right? And in fact, that wasn't what we said in the past. Right? In the past, there was buy-in to technology because people had a say in how it was used and how it would be operated. We can give workers a say in how technology is used and operated through things like collective bargaining, through things like works councils, through things like employment law. This is not particularly new, and nor is it really rocket science, but this is essential, because if there isn't that buy-in, then the discontent will spill out onto the street. That's why we have law, so we can discuss these ideas in the courtroom, in Parliament, and not in the street. Right? But if people begin to believe that the law or the government aren't neutral in this process, then we will see negative consequences from that. So people talk about Luddism, and nobody really wants to be a Luddite. Okay, not even me. Okay, I don't want to be a Luddite. But let's remember that Luddism was a response to the refusal of the courts in the early 19th century to enforce long-standing and quite clear laws for the protections of professions and guilds. Right? That discontent with the legal process, when courts refused to enforce very clear standards, that did spill over into society on a wider basis. And eventually, of course, Luddism failed because nothing could stop the advance of the machines. But in fact, in the very same areas where Luddism had been a powerful force, those were the same parts of the country that saw the first beginnings of what was then a new model for labour regulation that we called collective bargaining. Right? So collective bargaining replaced the old guild. And today we may think that the guilds are irrelevant, but in fact the guild is just another word for the profession. And the legal profession, the medical profession, and other professions are in the same position as the guilds were 200 years ago. We need to learn the lessons of history. We need to learn from this process and understand how technology was mediated in the recent past with a view to inclusive growth, because it's perfectly possible to do that.
Thank you, Simon. And before I let you give up the mic, building on the enthusiasm of the audience's response there, I think you may have done a kind of productivity assessment on the employment rights bill for the Department of Business and Trade. And obviously, as Mary's mentioned, there's been a building of the floor to make sure that there's a better baseline rights for people. Given what you've said, what more is there to be done, and what could that look like?
Well, I don't want to grab too much of the discussion here, but what I essentially say is that what we're now seeing with AI, it's really too soon to say what the productivity impact will be. I mean, it's still very, very early days. Right? It is certainly true that productivity is higher in some countries than others, and it's higher in the US than it is in Europe. Right? But actually, we're not yet really seeing, even in the US, the impact of AI. Productivity is high there for other reasons, partly to do with how well venture capital is organized in the US. What we're going to see in the short term, I suspect, with AI adoption, let's just take the legal profession as an example. What we're already seeing in the legal profession is a very chaotic process with a lot of hallucinations, a lot of early adoption of AI that isn't really working very well, a lot of misuse of AI, a lot of failure to track how AI is being used, which is going to give rise to a potentially large wave of liability claims against law firms that haven't properly vetted how some of their own employees and associates are using AI. This is going on right now. A lot of hype over AI apps, which are often being marketed without anybody really understanding how they work or where the training data are coming from. Now, this actually, again, is not unlike what happened 200 years ago. Right? The replacement of the guild by the factory was in some ways a similarly chaotic process. But we shouldn't assume that there's a linear relationship between the adoption of technology and productivity improvements. Right? Productivity has many, many causes. Right? Okay, so how we regulate labor and capital markets are a critical factor in productivity, but also in other things we really care about. We don't just care about productivity, we do care about the overall level of employment, and we care about the quality of work. Right. And productivity, again, isn't necessarily always correlated with high employment. It may be the opposite. And nor is it always correlated with job quality. So again, it depends what type of productivity we're talking about. Right. The type of productivity, which leads to employment growth over time and also leads to better work quality, that type of productivity we should be valuing. But productivity, which leads to work intensification and to a loss of employment, that's not necessarily something that's quite so easy to manage. So it matters how we regulate it. And there's a great deal of research, although how relevant this is to AI is difficult to know because AI has yet to have the major impact that previous technologies had. But we know from research that on the whole, employment rights are correlated positively with productivity. We know that. We know that from literally dozens of studies. We know that the major deregulatory waves in labor law in this country that took place since the 1980s are not correlated with either higher employment or higher productivity. Right? We know that thanks to social science research. So this is to say that the type of productivity we get and the type of technological innovation we get will very much depend upon how that process is regulated and governed, not just by laws relating to venture capital, but also by labor law.
Thank you, Simon. Bart, you look slightly tantalised or provoked, I hope, by some of those comments, and I just want to give you the floor.
Say it again, sorry, you couldn't hear that.
Well, I suppose I have some specific questions, but I wondered if you wanted to just reflect a little bit on...
To respond, yeah, absolutely. So there's good and bad productivity, but it is still productivity. Right, and as I said earlier, there's a sort of narrow definition of productivity, which is you measured GDP, whether has its shortcomings, because it takes a lot of bad stuff not into account, and it takes, by the way, also a lot of good stuff not into account. And we also measure a limited number of inputs. Quite often we only look at labor productivity, so we only measure the number of working hours that people are actually putting in, not even the skills that they're putting in. Or we measure something we call total factor productivity, which means we also take things as capital into account. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more in terms of resources needed to make AI happen. So I very much agree with Simon that the rapid productivity growth in the United States that we're seeing right now certainly is not just a story of AI. By the way, one thing that you didn't mention, which I think is absolutely critical, is that under the Biden government, an enormous amount of money was thrown at industrial policy that a lot of companies are now actually investing and beginning at least the labor productivity results to come from. So there's a lot more under the sun. Having said that, though, if you sort of build it up bottom up, the use cases of AI and the productivity it generates is very, very strong. If you look at the task level, and some of you are experiencing that yourself, the productivity gains are huge. If you're at the firm level, productivity gains get increasingly visible, but it's harder because companies need to do a lot more stuff than just making these investments in this kind of software. If you then take it to a sector level or to an economy-wide level, then we see much less effects because the number of companies, the number of places, the number of people that can adopt this is not that high yet. Could develop further, but it could also stop for exactly some of the reasons that you're describing. If we don't have good legal arrangements around it, then I think we could actually end up in a nightmare with all of this. So having said all that, I think the US in that sense is on a trajectory where it is gradually making faster progress on this than we do in the UK and that we're doing in Europe. Now, the other point that you were making earlier, which referred a little bit back to where I said I haven't seen that many cases where countries can grow that narrow concept of productivity fast through AI, and at the same time make it more inclusive, the good productivity that I was talking about. And then you started talking about collective bargaining and the kind of institutions we need to have around it. And actually there are some European countries, again, some of the Nordic countries come to mind first, that actually doing this reasonably well. If I go to Brussels, you know, and I'll talk about sort of what's happening in continental Europe, whether this is France or Germany or even Belgium and the Netherlands, then you think, well, not quite sure if that kind of debate around labor market institutions is really working all that well in order to create the kind of good productivity that we're having. So it's an extremely complex kind of set of factors that are playing a role that need to be more widely, that need a lot more attention in what we're actually trying to do and going forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Bart. So Mary, before we go to audience questions, so do snap the Slido and submit something so we can have that conversation subsequently. I suppose, what are your reflections on what you've heard, thinking about how we build the right capabilities to be prepared for what's coming? And yeah, what do we need to think about next?
Good question. So I think and sort of, you know, this is like quite a strong kind of personal thesis that I have about the role of government, is I think government absolutely has levers, it has responsibilities to look at the transition that we have ahead, and we've touched on some of them. You know, in particular, government proposes legislation, you know, it sort of holds some of our frameworks of rights and responsibilities. However, I also think that, you know, government is limited as well in kind of, first of all, like really understanding this transition. We really have to be very open in our partnerships and sort of humble in hearing from others to make sure that we understand this technology, that we understand the kind of structural implications of how it will diffuse through the economy. You know, also, I mentioned before, the emphasis that we put on data, that's a huge focus for us in terms of, you know, how can we have partnerships as well, you know, with companies that have great insights into the labour market too. So, you know, that's one area where we really need partnership, but we also need partnership in designing and implementing the solutions as well. I think, you know, Bart mentioned integration, and I think that's incredibly important in this. I actually find that my role within government, I sit within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, but so much of what I do is actually about trying to get round colleagues around government who own different bits of this question, you know, within the Department for Business and Trade that owns our sort of employment framework within, I've mentioned Department for Education, Work and Pensions as well. So, you know, there's that sort of collaboration within government, but also sort of more broadly, we need some really creative solutions, I think, for this. I think that we need to think in really novel ways. I talked a little bit about one line of inquiry being around skills and about the sort of skills pathway, but I mean, there's many others too. I think when we look at, and I, you know, emphasize again the sort of uncertainty that surrounds what we think labour market impacts will be, but when we look at that and we look at sort of the structures and the institutions and the processes we have in place, I think we can foresee that there will be some impacts, so there will be some areas or some demographics that are impacted that actually haven't, you know, been drawn through job finding institutions or reskilling institutions before, and what do we need to do to be to be relevant to that. So I think that's sort of a broad answer to your question, which is, you know, there is a great deal of thinking happening. There are initiatives that we are taking forward. I've mentioned some of those, but I think that this really needs to be quite a sort of broad dialogue and partnership. And yes, that's why we're delighted that Abby and others are on our expert panel, but also events like this are fantastic. So good to have this opportunity too.
Thank you, Mary. And I suppose for those that are thinking about how on earth could the government take on this task of forecasting in order to plan, I also want to give a shout out to a recent paper that we released by Eleni Papagiannaki, who's also in the audience today, thinking about the fact that there are just different variations of limited approach to methodologies for forecasting, because obviously the future is difficult to anticipate. So go and have a look at that to understand that kind of context a little bit more. But also really exciting that the AI Security Institute we're working in collaboration to think about how to do some of that with regard to these kind of trade-offs between different types of productivity and changes to roles in terms of how firms decide to reconfigure the value that's captured when adopting, be that through intensifying work, be that through upskilling work or de-skilling work, or various other kinds of routes to securing value in that context. So to come to some of the questions, and I'll also need to stand up and stand back. The first one that we have is, how do we prevent productivity metrics from overshadowing measures of well-being and inclusion, or human-centeredness has been very focal today, in fast-growing innovation ecosystems that often face deep inequalities and weaker social protections? So about preventing productivity metrics from becoming the same discourse that we've had historically that hasn't answered the challenge.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do a lot of work and time spending with both local authorities, but also with business executives around productivity. And we usually spend the first part of our conversation, or if it's a longer conversation, several hours, just talking about the narrative. Because the narrative around productivity hugely matters. It goes back to the distinction that I made earlier, that, if we just take a very narrow definition of efficiency, I mean, there can be little doubt that, including and inserting AI in your organization is creating these kind of efficiency gains. And we were talking, just a minute ago about how big are the productivity effects at the national level. Well, actually, you've got a regional level. During National Productivity Week, we had an event in Northern Ireland. And you wouldn't think, well, that's not really the place where you would expect impact of AI to be big. Well, actually, we find the impact of AI to be big. But what it actually did is creates efficiency gains for relatively low productivity firms in relatively low value added sectors. A lot of automation of relatively low value type of activity. So AI does do the job, but it doesn't create the kind of broader concept of productivity, which is how are we actually creating better outcomes for our customers, but also better outcomes for the people and for the places that we're actually working in. So having this discussion about what is the narrative around productivity and what do we want to achieve is critical to make that link with inclusivity. At the place-based level, that is even more so. As I mentioned earlier, when we spend this time with places, if you really want these new technologies to play out and give a role for companies and organizations that are in your area that want to use these technologies quite intensively, what is it you're doing with your investments in the further education system, with your investments in infrastructure, with your investment in health and housing, which does actually a couple of things. It makes it more attractive for these places to come. It made it more attractive for people to live and work there. And by the way, it also makes people pretty proud of a place if these kind of broader based investments are being done, which is very important in order to get the support for these kind of big transformative changes that we were talking about before.
Okay, anyone else want to come in on that one, or I'll move to the next question? Okay. How can we upskill workforce in this country when basic numerical and language literacy is not well grounded? Shouldn't the government get the foundation right and scaffold from there? Mary, I'm really sorry, but it feels like that was coming.
I turned the mic on. I knew that was me. So I think when we talk about our skilling work, we talk about our pipeline from classroom to boardroom. The upskilling work that I've been describing has very much been focused at basically the existing workforce. It's kind of for people who are already employed. We have a real focus on SMEs as well. And so I guess obviously making assumptions, but the sort of numerical and literacy skill set is presumably already fairly in place for people who are already in work, and it's about how do we actually give people the skills to, first of all, sort of use AI in their workplace, but also the confidence to kind of think of their career pathways beyond that as well. That said, it is absolutely the case that we work in particular with our partners across government about sort of actually what's the role of AI in that sort of pipeline. This is less something that I lead on personally, but we have what we describe as a big bet, which is about how do we use AI in the classroom, and DFE are leading out on pilots about how do you sort of build AI tutors into the classroom, again, in a way where that they're sort of tools and assistants for teachers, but in particular can sort of really be tailored to an individual pupil's experience in a way that an individual teacher might struggle to do in a classroom. So I guess my point there is it's not the case that we've abandoned the foundations that have been asked about in the question. And in fact, we're looking at, well, what is the role of AI in potentially being a tool that could help us with some of those long-standing challenges, and to make sure that that still remains a really core focus and priority as well.
Can I add a little thing to this? Actually, as part of National Productivity Week, our Northeast Yorkshire Humber Forum does an annual skills survey. And they did this again this year, and I'm sort of literally reading it out here. One thing that I indeed do find is that the skills that organizations, still businesses in that region, still think most important is numeracy and literacy. And then yes, they are spending some time on digital skills and advanced digital skills, but most of these skills are to automate relatively low-level administrative type of tasks. So the message from this is actually a limited amount of economic activity that you can really use AI for higher valued activity that augments labor much more substantially, and so on and so forth. What we also find is that because there's a big skills drain from these regions, particularly if the sort of the people have the real data science skills, is that the demand of organizations for skills is actually gradually going down to sort of secondary application type of skills of AI technology. Now the question again is that bad? I mean, we can't have the technology readers everywhere in the country, and if you actually have really good applications of AI technology, maybe that sort of second level non-graduate type AI skills is actually something that is quite useful to drive productivity, but it actually then comes back to the point that needs to really give local authorities or combined authorities a lot more power in order to be able to organize their skills system together with the FE colleges in such a way that demand and supply for these skills are much better matched than is the case today.
Thank you, Bart. And to move maybe away from just the questions on the screen, but to come to perhaps our final, depending on time before closing. In the Preparedness review, one of the things that we were interested in was, I suppose, recognising that there is a significant conversation about skills and upskilling, both in AI and in other aspects of the economy as people move around through this transition. We were also hoping to draw attention to kind of capabilities as more than skills. So, for instance, and this has been work that's been led by Dr. Magdalena Sofia, who's our Associate Director of Social Research, the ways in which frameworks such as that from Amartya Sen think about different types of freedom, and that also being important in resilience and adaptability. So freedoms cultivated in the workplace that might be changed through the adoption of AI, including things like the extent of voice that you have, the extent of autonomy that you have, and also kind of critical thinking, and that they're also important foundations for democracy, basically, that you build a populace that has that. So with that in mind, Simon, I know that you think about this space quite a lot. What are your reflections, maybe to close, on how we build an agenda for institutions that's one for resilience through this challenge, that also thinks about capabilities?
Well, I think it would be really important to try to improve general knowledge in our society about numbers, and in particular about statistics. Right? And I speak here as a lawyer. I teach in a law school. We're on the humanities side. Okay, sure. But I'm also a social scientist, and I do a lot of measuring things in my work. Right? So I try to measure things which are very difficult to measure. So we talk about GDP. That's hard enough. Actually, total factor productivity is really hard to measure. But even harder to measure is law. Even harder to measure are institutions. So much of my work is about trying to do that. Then I work with statisticians with the data that we produce to try to answer questions about what the impact of legal change and technological change will be. I've had to learn or relearn a lot about statistics and mathematics to do what I do. And increasingly the people I teach in the law school at Cambridge want to know more about statistics. They want to be more numerate. That, I think, would be the first thing we should be doing as a society. Not just literacy, but digital literacy, numeracy in this sense, is going to be really essential as we move forward. And it's no longer going to be acceptable to say that we have this divide between the sciences and the arts. This we really have to move away from. But equally, on the science side, there has to be an understanding that science is experimental and involves judgment. All the things that we're teaching in history, in English, in literature, in the classics, these things remain important, it seems to me. So at the basic educational level, we shouldn't be having a system in which everybody at A level is just doing STEM subjects. That's completely wrong. And actually, by the way, many of those people who have been doing maths, higher maths and physics in the last 2 or 3 years at A level may be worried when they read that the first people to be losing their jobs are those doing coding. Right, okay. Now, that may or may not be true. Okay, this is all part of the problem with discussion, public discussion about AI. Much of it is just not very well informed. And sometimes a lot of it is, I think, a little bit inflammatory, right? The risks of AI, some of the risks that are being pointed out are not real risks or won't be for a very long time, but everyday risks are being underplayed and forgotten about. That's not a healthy situation either. If I said to you that AI, actually we shouldn't even really be calling it that, but machine learning is basically a kind of extended autocomplete that you have on your phone, which really is all it is, actually. And I know there'll be different views on this, and some people will say, well, as of next year, it won't be. But given what it is, we ought to all be able to understand it better. And if we understood it better, we might be a little bit less afraid of it, in my view. The reason people in a profession like law are worried about AI is partly because of a lack of understanding about what it is, and also maybe a lack of trust about how it will be used. There are societies, there are industries, there are sectors where there's more trust, and there are those where there is less trust. Right. If I said to you that the scandal which occurred a few years ago in the Netherlands, where people were falsely accused of a type of benefit fraud, and which led to children being taken away, and also to suicides, if I said to you that was caused by AI, it was caused by AI, but you hardly ever hear this, right? And that the same methods are now being introduced into our own universal credit system. You shouldn't really be surprised about that. This is actually public knowledge, and this ought to be more widely known. There can be a debate about these things, and there should be an informed debate. That's where I would start.
Thank you, Simon. I don't know if anyone else saw the piece in the FT this weekend that found that of American graduates, those that studied philosophy were seeing the highest rates of employment, and it had the tagline, scrap Python, study Plato. So there you go. If your kids are asking you what to do when they go to uni, or if they go. So thank you very much. That was an incredibly rich conversation. I just want to highlight to whoever asked the questions about the relationship between sectors and how that's part of getting this right, that's very much what we're hoping to do at the Institute for the Future of Work, to convene these different groups to think about how to do that. So please join me in thanking our incredible panellists.